Friends, colleagues, esteemed guests, welcome to this fourth in our Bicentenary series of 2022 Gifford Lectures. My name is Carl Lydecker, and I am the Senior Vice Principal of the University of Aberdeen. The Gifford Lectures are named after the prominent Scottish advocate and judge, Lord Adam Gifford, who died in 1887. In his will, he provided for a series of lectures to be held at each of the four ancient universities of Scotland, Aberdeen, Edinburgh, Glasgow, and St Andrews, with a view to promoting, advancing, teaching, and diffusing the study of natural theology in the widest sense of that term. Since 1888, the Gifford Lectures have become one of the most renowned public intellectual events in the humanities anywhere in the world. Here in Aberdeen, Gifford Lectures have been delivered by luminaries as varied as Etienne Gilson, Karl Barth, Hannah Arendt, Eleonora Stump, Sarah Coakley, Mona Siddiqui, and N.T. Wright. Our programme of 2022 lectures commemorates the bicentenary of the birth of Lord Gifford. And to continue our series this evening, we are honoured and delighted to add a further distinguished name to our roster of Aberdeen Gifford lecturers. Our speaker for this occasion is Tim Whitmarsh, who is the A.G. Leventis Professor of Greek Culture at the University of Cambridge. He is the author of over 100 articles and 9 books, including Battling the Gods, Atheism in the Ancient World, and Dirty Love, the Genealogy of the Ancient Greek Novel. He is the general editor of the Oxford Classical Dictionary and has written for The Guardian, the Times Literary Supplement, and the London Review of Books, as well as appearing on BBC Radio and TV. And he is currently editing a volume of translations of the Greek epic poets of the Roman Empire. Professor Whitmarsh, we are delighted that in your very busy schedule, you have made time to come to Aberdeen in order to be here for this event. And I now invite you to the podium to deliver your Gifford lecture entitled Religion and Ancient Mediterranean Thought.
Well, thank you very much for that very generous introduction, and thank you for the invitation. It's a real pleasure and an honour to be here. And just to repeat, thank you very much for coming out on such a dramatic evening. It is a real honour to take this opportunity to participate in this terrific series of lectures specially designed for the delayed bicentenary of Adam Gifford's birth. My topic today is religion and ancient Mediterranean thought, and I take it that my main job is to show how my discipline, which is the discipline of classics, can contribute to modern discussions of religion. Classics is broadly the study of the ancient Mediterranean world from 1000 BC through to AD 500, a period in which the politically dominant groups in the region became first Greek speakers and then Latin speakers. Historically, classics was thought to be the study of Greek and Roman literature, the body of texts composed by elite representatives of those linguistic communities, a canon that includes authors like Homer, Sophocles, Herodotus, Plato, Cicero, Virgil, and Ovid. The growth of disciplines like ancient history and archaeology in the 19th century, however, and sociology and cultural studies in the 20th century have moved us away from thinking of texts simply as repositories for timeless values, for ancient thought, if you like, and towards thinking of them as documents of social processes. This has also meant that literature is no longer seen as occupying a different, more elevated plane. It is continuous with all other forms of cultural production, like stone inscriptions, graffiti, art, architecture, and artisanship. That's to say, literary texts constitute a unique class of ancient document, but they are not more unique than, say, vases or tax receipts. Literature of all forms, then, is folded into cultural history. And to analyse its meaning, we need to understand it against the backdrop of history. But this is where matters become more difficult. History is at root the study of change and agency. It's the study of events and their causes. If something can be shown to have happened, then the historian asks why it happened. Now, the risk is evidently one of reductionism, of simplifying those causal structures. That risk is magnified most conspicuously when ideologies are at stake, whether that ideology is Marxism, which in its crudest form can reduce the cause of everything to class war, or any other form of ideology. Such reductive explanations, sometimes called monocausal, are doubly problematic. They not only simplify the complex twine of historical factors that create change, but also ignore the improvising role of human creativity in change. There's always some element of unpredictability in human culture, some aspect that can't be reduced to the determination of historical forces. So practicing cultural history is not straightforward. It involves giving historical explanation for significant changes in human culture without simplifying or reducing. Nevertheless, it is, I think, our best tool for making sense of those aspects of ancient Greco-Roman thought that still structure our experience today. And it matters to do this because so much of what we do today is based on hunches and intuitions about things that happened in the ancient world, amplified by 19th century fiction, 20th century Hollywood movies, and 21st century TV shows and YouTube channels. Trying to gain a richer understanding of the classical world is something we owe ourselves as well as the ancients. Cultural history is, at the simplest level, the analysis of human experience within time and space. In this lecture, I focus primarily on space, although time will come in inevitably because time and space are so interlinked. In particular, I want to think about how the Mediterranean itself became the agent, or an agent, in the formation of religious thought. Or rather, not the sea itself, but new ways of imagining and experiencing that complex of sea and landmass, both ringing, the landmass that both rings and juts into the ancient Mediterranean. My central thesis is this, that two different revolutions in the way that space was encountered, first in the way that marine space was encountered, and the second in the way that terrestrial space was encountered, had profound effects on the ways in which religious thought developed in the Greco-Roman world, even if they don't constitute monocausal explanations for change. Now, when we talk of ancient Mediterranean religions, we're talking primarily of the religions of urban areas. It's very easy to take the idea of the city for granted as a feature not only of the modern landscape, but also of the medieval and early modern periods, periods that conjure names like Genoa, Hamburg, Leiden, Al-Andalus. But if we start our story in around 1000 BC, there were very few spaces in the Mediterranean basin as a whole that we could count as urbanized. Only on the eastern coast, modern Lebanon, Syria, and Turkey, and in Egypt, were the walled cities with dedicated temples and complex literate bureaucracies, although Greece had palace economies by this stage. Urbanization spilled over into the Mediterranean from the older urban cultures of the ancient Near East, particularly the developed river valley civilizations that had grown up in Egypt beside the Nile and in what is now called Iraq and what the Greeks called Mesopotamia. There's a reason why the earliest great powers in the region, the larger region, were founded around river valleys. And we see similar patterns in the east, too, where urban centers clustered around the Yangtze River in China and the Ganges in India. In the ancient world, transport by water was much quicker, cheaper, and easier than transport by land. Rivers were like modern arterial motorways. They were long, flat, boring places that would take you from A to B, pleasingly boring places. We often think of ancient cultures in terms of fixed spaces built of brick and stone. But what made those fixed spaces possible were the spaces in between them. A city is not an island, but a node, the destination point of routes that are important for human commerce, communication, pilgrimage, strategy, and so forth. The river civilizations could only expand into inland empires once they'd secured a flourishing river development up around the banks. Now, there's also a reason why the Mediterranean as a whole experienced rapid urbanization in the first millennium BC, in the period that we call the Iron Age. Shipping technology improved markedly during the late second millennium, so that from around 1200 BC, the people we call the Phoenicians, based in modern Lebanon, in Tyre and Sidon, sorry, I've lost track. So that from around 1200 BC, the people we call the Phoenicians, based in modern Lebanon, in Tyre and Sidon, developed new strategies for sailing on the open sea. The trick to sailing on the open sea is to be able to deal with changing winds, and that meant having complete control over the sail. Sailors on a Phoenician ship could either rotate the sail by using a boom or furl and unfurl it using brails. These new technologies meant that the entire Mediterranean became a connector, a much more sophisticated, open and multifaceted surface than the river valleys. Minerals, for example, could be mined in Spain, worked in Greece, and then sold in Egypt. So there you have the Mediterranean in front of you. This new trading environment was the making of first Greece and then Italy, the two peninsulae that now occupied the dominant positions controlling the trade networks between the eastern and western Mediterranean. This brought wealth, and wealth brought ambition. From the 9th century BC onwards, Greeks began a massive program of cultural appropriation, taking from the Phoenicians both their shipping technology and their alphabet, together with the numerous other forms of luxury craft and manufacture. Greeks and Phoenicians now established what we call colonies or trading depots all over the Mediterranean rim, and this is the origins of Mediterranean urbanization. The Phoenicians along the coast of North Africa, eastwards from Tunisia, which are in red on the map, and the Greeks in Libya, southern Italy, and the south coast of France, and these are the ones in blue on the map. It was this web of interlinked colonial sites that, as I say, brought urbanization to the Western Mediterranean. Many modern Mediterranean cities like Cadiz, Nice, Algiers, and Naples can trace their origins to this era. Now, these cities are at one level dots on a map, but at another level, they are the nodes of an interconnected network. One major networking link could be that between a colony and its mother city, in Greek metropolis, from which its original inhabitants hailed, or at least were held to have hailed. There was a lot of myth-making, of course, in early colonial origin stories. But the cities that sprang up along the Mediterranean coasts were also networked with each other, nor were networks necessarily stable over time. One very good example of a chronologically layered network comes with the island of Thasos in the northern Aegean Sea. Now, the northern Aegean, hang on. There we go. Now, northern Greece is rich in minerals, and Thasos has gold. This buried wealth first attracted the attention of Phoenician settlers from the city of Tyre. In the mid-7th century, however, Greek colonists arrived from the island of Paros, further south, right at the bottom of the map. If you can see the word Google, it is just to the right of there. Now, in the 5th century, Paros fell under the influence of Athens, and as a result, our city, Thasos up in the top, became the Athenian springboard into the northern Greek mainland. So Thasos' networks were multiple and shifting over time. Now, what does this have to do with religion? The crucial point for our purposes is that the gods of cities come to symbolize their networks in this era. On Thasos, the Phoenicians established a temple to Melkart, the patron god. Here we go. Yep. The patron god of Tyre, whose name presumably derives from the Semitic root MLK, Malak, which is at the root of, for example, the Arabic name Malik. This created a simple linear link between the island, Thasos, and its mother city, Tyre. When the Parians arrived, however, the temple was preserved. And here we have the remains of that temple on Thasos, and Melkart was still worshipped, but now he was assimilated to the Greek demigod Heracles. This link between the Phoenician god and the Greek god was at one level entirely conventional. It was the norm in ancient non-monotheist cultures to assume that another culture's gods were the same as your own, only going under different names, a phenomenon that's sometimes called divine translatability. But this also meant that Thasos could be linked to its Greek parent cities, Paros and Athens, whilst also retaining its links to Tyre. In such cases, there was no attempt to erase the god's Phoenician past. In fact, he might be known as Heracles of Tyre precisely to remember that Phoenician past. At the same time, the name Heracles gave the god a very different flavour to his Phoenician original. In Phoenician mythology, Melkart was a static god who had fixed the floating island of Tyre to the seabed and protected it in situ. So close was his association with Tyre that his temple in a new site like Thasos can only have been seen as a mirror of the original. The Greek Heracles, by contrast, was a great traveller who tended to arrive in barbarous places, subdue a local monster or two, and leave some sort of material trace of his presence amongst the grateful inhabitants. Heracles was exactly the kind of figure who might have turned up in a remote island, bashed around a lion or a water snake, and had his visit commemorated in a temple. Heracles was a prolific founder of ancient cities, usually in places that are out of the way or off the Greek mainland. A Greek temple of Heracles didn't necessarily link you back to a mother city, although, as it happens, there is a link to Paros. Paros is one of the sites where Heracles is said to have put in the course of his labours. But in general, what Heracles represented was not a single line. These are this is a rather distorting image with its three simple lines. Heracles represented the network itself. He represented the mobility of the Greek hero-stroke-divine structure around the whole Mediterranean space. He was the embodiment of the capacity of Greek culture to manifest itself anywhere in the complex, fragmented, island-dominated space of the Aegean Sea, and indeed far beyond the Aegean Sea. His most westerly temple, again known as the Temple of Tyrian Heracles, was in Cadiz, near the so-called Pillars of Heracles, which is to say the Straits of Gibraltar. Of course, the Pillars of Heracles were thought to be the things that held the sky up. Now, a figure like Heracles shows the fundamental importance to early Greek religion of the ideas of place and space. Gods are not worshipped in the abstract, but in specific locations, and those locations signify in complex ways. On the one hand, a participant in the worship of Heracles on Thasos, worship that would, as ever, be centered on the act of animal sacrifice, it's a very act-based religious structure, would be engaging principally with her local community. Sacrifice was an act of community building based around the shared shock at the act of slaughter, followed by the shared pleasure in the consumption of tasty meat. But as we've seen, the figure of Heracles is more than just a local god. He represents the island's connection to multiple ancient cities, both in the wider Greek world in general, and in this case, the Phoenician site of Tyre. And I would say, beyond that, he represents the potential for greater linkages. He's always a pluralizing god. He's always a god who can move more than he has already. So participating in cult sacrifice for the Thasians was to scroll back in time through the archive of collective memory and collective myth-making, and to take a virtual tour in the imagination across the Mediterranean world. Space is essential to any understanding of religions like those of Greek and Phoenician cities. This was a world of polytheism, of many gods, but principles of economy always applied. At one level, gods multiplied as new cities and new cult sites were founded. These gods could be individualized by taking on additional surnames that spoke to the local context, or they could be merged with local divinities so that statues could be, again, individualized and look quite distinct. If you think about the famous statues of Artemis at Ephesus, for example, with the famous possibly multi-breasted kind of appearance, this is a very distinctive manifestation of Artemis. But at the same time, the entire divine system tended to fold back in on itself, so that Artemis of Ephesus remained Artemis, in a sense, the universal idea of the goddess Artemis. Your local god could be identified with all the other deities that were similarly named in the known world. Your Heracles, your Artemis, or your Apollo was your god, tethered securely to the regional landscape, but at the same time, this god was simply the local manifestation of a wider idea of that god. Gods were experienced primarily in local space. These were not transcendent beings who exist outside of time and space, but partially embodied figures who might be thought of as given concrete forms in their cult statues, and in one sense in inhabiting their statues, their temples, with the temple attendants as their servants, but only in one sense. In another sense, gods were abstract beings. Heracles on Thasos was not just a local deity, he was also the local version of an idea of Heracles, an idea that existed not in any one particular place, but within the pan-Mediterranean network as a whole. So a god was in this era a complex figure, a paradoxical mixture of the present and the absent, the local and the general, the embodied and the abstract. In fact, we might say part of the social function of the idea of the god was precisely to mediate between these two poles, to allow people whose existence was confined to one small, delimited space, a town, a city, an island even, to conceptualize their relationship to the wider inhabited world. When we look to the Greek poetry of this era, it's surprising how often gods are represented as elsewhere and on the move between one place and another. Homer's Iliad, for example, which is 8th century or so. I mean, the dating of the Iliad is a whole other question, but let's say 8th century for our purposes. Homer's Iliad begins with the priest Chryses, upset by Agamemnon's mistreatment of his daughter, summoning Apollo down from Olympus. Homer's account of the god's descent from Olympus to bring plague to the Greeks is famously sublime. Down from the peaks of Olympus he strode, angry at heart, with his bow and covered quiver on his shoulders. The arrows rattled on the shoulders of the angry god as he moved, and his coming was like the night. Then he sat down apart from the ships and let fly an arrow. Terrible was the twang of his silver bow. Now, aside from the startling poetry with its complex imagery and its multi-sensory focus on sound and sight, one thing is very clear. The god's presence is a devastatingly powerful thing, but it needs to be conjured. The god needs to be brought into the scene of action. To appear in a place, the god must be drawn to it by a powerful agent, a priest in this case, promising, as Chryses has done, a bounteous sacrifice. The elsewhere from which Apollo arrives is Olympus, which is a real but impossibly remote place in Greek thought, a mountain whose peak, the highest point on the Greek peninsula, was not scaled by humans till the early 20th century. Theologically speaking, Olympus represents not a fixed point on a two-dimensional map, but a super-elevated point on the vertical axis, a place from which all other places can be reached, the nodal point where the entire Mediterranean colonial network folds in on itself. Gods, then, were vehicles for thinking through the interrelationship between the local and the pan-Mediterranean. This phenomenon is partly related to the emergent idea of Greekness as a unified identity, binding together all speakers of Greek and all worshippers of Greek gods. The Greek world was not politically unified, but from the 8th century BC onwards, we do begin to see the emergence of notions of cultural identity, materialized in institutions like the Delphic Oracle and the Olympic Games, which were open only to elite Greek athletes, if you recognize that figure. But we should beware projecting modern nationalist conceptions of identity back onto the ancient world, where no one carried a passport, where multilingualism was common, where structures of memory and affiliation were much more complex. And this is why I've focused on the worship of Tyrian Heracles on the island of Thasos, which is an excellent example of how Greekness is not the sole explanation for the phenomenon that we've been talking about, because the Phoenician cultural heritage was integrated into the Greek in this case, hierarchically to be sure, but clearly without erasing it. To the contrary, the cult site was a living archive of the island's complex colonial history. Now, to present I'm not trying to present Greek religion as a whole in these terms, because that would be overly simplistic. There were many more aspects to the Greek experience of the divine, including more philosophical and contemplative traditions, worship within the family unit, belief in salvation after death, and so forth. And in particular, I don't want to suggest that Greek thought lacked a spiritual dimension in contrast to Christianity, or a sense of personal communion with the divine. This whole area, of course, is fearsomely complex, where so much depends on what we mean by terms like spiritual and personal. Nor did Greek religion remain static over time. There were all sorts of innovations, of course. But enough has been said, I think, to make the important point that the scaffolding of Greek polytheistic religion was erected during the colonial era, and cult worship helped participants to understand their place in a complex, fragmented geopolitical world, and to feel situated in both a local and a pan-Mediterranean context. Now let's move through time and space with disconcertingly Apolline rapidity to a different era of Greco-Roman history. In 31 BC, Gaius Octavius, the future Emperor Augustus, defeated the armada of Antony and Cleopatra off the coast of near Actium in northwestern Greece, thus bringing to completion a process of Roman expansion over the Mediterranean basin that had begun 200 years earlier. It isn't clear when Romans first began to conceive of the territories they controlled, directly or indirectly, as a unified empire, or when they aspired to control the known world, probably quite late. But what is certain is that when Gaius Octavius, now known as Augustus, consolidated his power in the 20s BC, in the aftermath of his victory, there was no escaping the idea of Rome as a universal empire, a civilizing force with a right to rule over you. In Book 1 of Virgil's Aeneid, the grandest expression of Augustan ideology and power, the top Roman god Jupiter grants Aeneas's descendants famously imperium sine fine, empire without end. And without end is to be understood here in both spatial and temporal terms. The age of Augustus promised world domination for eternity. A single unified Roman order would now supplant the fragmented Greek world. At its head would be Augustus, a supposed descendant of Aeneas, albeit not biologically, thanks to his adoption by Julius Caesar. And it wasn't just poetry that was telling the story. Augustus created an entire propagandistic ideology of world rule. Any medium available was put to the service of mythologizing the empire. Coinage, architecture, statuary, gems, you name it. The image you have in front of you, a cameo sculpture created from a large piece of sardonyx, about 30 centimeters tall, was created after Augustus's death. The images occupy three tiers. At the bottom, we see a ragtail group of captives, now subordinate to Rome. In the center of the central tier, we find the Emperor Tiberius, who may have been on the throne at the time that the cameo was created. And at the top, we have the deified Augustus. Just below Augustus, we see a winged figure carrying an orb, which represents the world, in Latin orbis. The combination of scepter, you notice that both Augustus and Tiberius carry the scepter, the staff, and orb has, of course, become central to the iconography of kingship throughout the ages, including that of the British monarchy. It represents the conjunction of local authority, the scepter held by the monarch, a quasi-weapon symbolizing his control of state violence, and global rule, or at least the aspiration to it. The structure of the cameo also, in a sense, represents an image of the world. The central tier represents the earthly plane, the lowest the underworld, and the highest the heavens. So we have a way of mapping out the world in a very small, compact object. There's an element of fantasy to all ideology, of course. The Romans never came close to controlling all of the world, not even that portion of it that they knew about. But ideology drives policy, and the Augustan era saw both a massive expansion of the domains controlled by the Romans into modern Slovenia, Hungary, Romania, and much more, but also a massive expansion of the idea of the world, the ramping up of the rhetoric of the world domination. At the same time, and crucially for my purposes, Augustus interconnected this world. He created the network that linked together this landmass, networking up space in ways that the world had not known beforehand and arguably would not know again until the 18th century. Other ancient and medieval empires had road networks, but none invested so much in the manufacture of uniform, high-tech, well-polished surfaces that facilitated rapid wheeled transport and expressed the dominance of human civilization over nature. At the centre of the road network was, of course, Rome. All roads did quite literally lead to Rome, or more precisely, to the golden milestone, Miliarium Aureum, set up by Augustus near the Temple of Saturn in 20 BC. In the words of Plutarch, this was a gilded column where all the roads that crisscross Italy terminate. Romans invested huge amounts into the mapping of the Mediterranean. Maps were both practical and ideological documents. They directly aided the governance of foreign provinces by showing how troops and trade might be moved around the chessboard, but they were also propagandistic representations of Roman dominance. Where Greeks had once celebrated control over the sea with maritime narratives like Homer's Odyssey and the story of the Argonauts, Romans celebrated control of the land. We don't have anything more than fragments of Roman maps, but we do have medieval maps based on Roman originals. Here is a detail from a famous one. This is the so-called Poitinger map, which is possibly a descendant of a map commissioned by Augustus himself and displayed publicly in the Porticus Vipsania in Rome. At the centre, pulsar-like, is the city of Rome itself, ringed by a fiery circle of yellow. And elsewhere, though there are geophysical features, most is just lines. But they're not just lines. They're not just static marks etched onto a plane. The lines are the thing. They throb with dynamic potential. They're the arteries that give life to the Roman organism. From the time of the Roman Principate, we read for the first time stories of road trips. In the Greek world, to risk an overgeneralization, strange events tend to happen at sea. This is the story of the Odyssey. Romans were not immune to the imaginative potential of the sea, of course not, but they loved roads. One of the most famous novels of the 2nd century AD is the Metamorphoses, or Golden Ass of Apuleius. Apuleius' tragicomic masterpiece opens with the narrator Lucius travelling on horseback to Thessaly in Greece, along, to quote, steep mountain tracks and slippery valley roads, damp places in the meadows, and cloddy paths through the fields. It's the texture of this description of the roads. Then he meets up with two other travellers and revels in their spooky tales. Once arrived in Thessaly, he lodges with a woman who's a practicing witch and can transform herself into a bird. Gripped by curiosity, he tries out her magical unguent and becomes an ass instead of a bird. He's then stolen by robbers and condemned to a life again on the road, where numerous adventures befall him, but before finally he secures his conversion back to human form, and indeed his conversion to the devotion of the goddess Isis. This is a novel centred on the road network. Events take place not just in the places connected by the roads, but along the way too. Like all ancient adventure stories, it is at one level indebted to Homer's Odyssey, but it's also a very modern Roman tale in which roads play a starring role. It was likewise on the road that Saul of Tarsus, the future Apostle Paul, had what is arguably the most famous change of heart in human history. According to Acts, while travelling to Damascus to root out Christians, he saw a light from heaven and heard a voice crying, "Saul, Saul, why do you harass me?" Thereafter, Saul found himself unable to see or eat for 3 days until he was baptized, and, again to quote, something like scales fell away from his eyes. Paul was a Greek Jew, or a Jewish Greek, if you prefer, and there are good parallels in earlier Greek culture and in the Hebrew Bible for such intense experiences of conversion, as we tend to call it. But in Greek and Jewish culture, such experiences are almost always take place in sacred space of some kind, where divinity is experienced in its maximally intense form. Only Paul experiences divine power on the road. Roads don't just connect, to reiterate the point, they are imaginative spaces in their own right, environments where things happen. This goes for Acts as much as it does for Apuleius. In terms of the story that Acts of the Apostles weaves, Paul's conversion on the road can be seen as a narrative prefiguration, a kind of prolepsis of the life of the road that Paul himself eventually took up as a missionary. Acts is fundamentally a story of Roman roads. As this version presents it, the years after Jesus' death saw a power struggle in the nascent church between those who wanted the cult to be centered statically in Jerusalem and others who wanted to proselytize far and wide. The latter movement was, of course, spearheaded by Paul. In the late 40s AD, he and his friend Barnabas made the first of his 3 visits to Galatia, a Roman province centered on the Anatolian plateau in the heart of modern Turkey. Now, up until now, the Jesus cult had been largely confined to Judea, roughly modern Israel, and the Syrian coast, roughly modern Lebanon, and conversion attempts had been limited to the Jewish diaspora. The mission of Paul and Barnabas, according to Acts at least, changed all of this. This was the first serious push to spread the cult of Jesus beyond Jews and amongst the Gentiles of the wider Greek world, wider Greco-Roman world. The events of the trip itself were dramatic, but let's focus on the trip itself. After making the journey by sea from the island of Cyprus, Paul and Barnabas made land at Perge on the south coast. You can see all of this on the map. I can give you a quick pointer. There's oh no, hang on, that's the wrong button. There's Perge there, or for those of you on this side, it is there. Perga, as it's put on this map. So that's where they land. Then they head northwards inland to Antioch in Pisidia, the second city of Galatia. Then Paul and Barnabas, they fall out with the local Jewish community. This is part of the narrative of Acts, is how they always fall out with local Jewish communities. They hot-tail it east to the city of Iconium. Things go pretty much the same. They fall out with the local Jews and they have to run away for fear of being stoned. And they head south to Lystra, where Paul miraculously heals a lame man, but once again gets stoned. Paul gets grievously injured and left for dead. And then they try again in Derbe with some success before retracing their steps back through Galatia, reinforcing their messages to locals on the way. Now, I single out this journey for 2 reasons. One is that it is, in a way, another Odyssean adventure story updated and adapted to the world of Roman roads. Or if you prefer, it's a kind of the story that Kerouac would have written had he been a first century Christian. The other reason, though, is that this is not just any old road. This trip could not have happened without the Emperor Augustus, who created the province of Galatia in 25 BC and stationed a legion there. Crucially, a Roman road was built in 6 BC, the Via Sebasti, or the Augustan road. This led from Perge, where Paul landed by ship on the coast, northwest up to Lake Burda. It then arced east to Antioch, onwards towards Iconium, and then from there we've got a branch line down south to Lystra. So this is exactly the same route that they followed. Without this road and without Roman troops ensuring a semblance of peace, the first mission would have been far too perilous and arduous. Quite apart from bandits and potentially hostile locals, the geology of the region would have been against them. And Paul, crucially, would have known this. I mean, he was from this general area, from Cilicia in the south, on the south coast. So he would have known, as I say, he would have. This is the dangers of the inland Anatolian plain were very well known to people in this era. In southern Anatolia generally, the advent of Roman roads was as exciting a development as that of air travel or the internet 2 millennia later. Roads meant experiencing new peoples, new commodities, new foodstuffs, new building techniques, and new ideas. The Via Sebasti will have been planned out systematically by land surveyors accompanying Augustus's troops when they first pacified, to use that awful euphemism, Pisidia. Its construction will have involved not just the laying of rubble and dressed stone, but also hewing into natural rock, fording streams and rivers and bridging gullies with arches. The famed straightness of Roman roads was not just a convenience, it was also a way of telling the landscape and its human users who was boss. The reshaping and interconnecting of the known world created not just the practical opportunity for Gentile missionary work, but also a symbolic precedent for it. In a sense, Paul aimed to bring civilization, that perilously ambivalent gift, to the backwaters just as much as Augustus did. And this is my crucial point. It wasn't just that the Roman world facilitated the expansion of Christianity. From the very start, Christianity was shaped by the experience of existing within the dynamic road network of the Roman Empire and built a new structure of religious affiliation that existed not just in the nodal points in the cities, but in the network itself. Unlike all other ancient religions, Pauline Christianity was not, in any strong sense, bound to specific spaces. Churches, as we all know, are in fact a strikingly late development in the history of Christianity, a 3rd century phenomenon. Before that, Christians met in domestic spaces. There are similarities, of course, to the model of networked space that we saw in the early Greek world. In both cases, religious experience connects the individual to a wider community in the mind, allows you to travel across space. There are also, of course, similarities to the model of diaspora Judaism, where religious activities taking place away from Jerusalem could forge emotional connections to the temple, taking communities on what we might call virtual pilgrimages. But early Christianity was something different. It was a way of thinking through the radically decentered, non-spatialized form of networking that was emerging at the time. It was a religion of the road, if you like. Early Christians, in fact, often speak of their movement as the way. The image is clearly a Hebrew biblical theological image, but the Greek word odos, simply means road. So early Christians were describing themselves as the road, if you like. We translate it as the way, which sounds more, as I say, theologically evocative, but you could just call it the road or the street. What gave substance and content to this rather abstract idea of a networked Christianity? The answer, in my view, or at least one answer, is a form of technology that was far from new to the Roman world, but the role of which was transformed by Roman trade and networking. The story of early Christianity's relationship with the book is a long, complex and largely speculative one, which would take a whole new lecture altogether, and probably not a lecture by me, but we can't ignore it for our purposes. In the earliest centuries of Christianity, there was, of course, no New Testament. The very earliest followers of Jesus had no written texts to preserve stories of his life and memories of his sayings, which were circulated presumably orally in the first instance. Even the earlier Gospels, literate products of later generations though they are, retain much of the oral imprint. But with the letters of Paul, we begin to see something that looks like the first steps in the formation of a canon of Christian text. Letter collections are a distinctively Roman phenomenon, product of an elite culture that constructed networks of cultured friendship between provincial governors and allies at Rome, or between exiles and their supporters back home, or between pupils and teachers. Paul's letters, although not elite in the same way, should be ranked alongside those of Cicero, Seneca, and Pliny as portraits of the author, gifts to posterity disclosing what the great man was like behind the scenes. As with Cicero and others, Paul was presumably at some level behind the publication process of his text. This is entirely speculative, of course. But we do have, it's clear that he worked with a team, with Timothy, Silvanus, and Titus, although what exactly they were doing, whether they were involved in the writing process, the copying process, the editing process, that's all unknown. But he did have a team around him. And the crucial point is that these letters operated at several different levels. On the one hand, whatever the content of the letters themselves, which can be quite critical, addressing an epistle to a particular community was a gift to that community, a mark of recognition. To have a letter from Paul was no doubt a sign that your church had arrived. It was a foundational document to hoard and treasure. So at one level, we're talking about a single, linear act of communication. On the other hand, letters like Paul's presumably existed to be copied and recopied. They didn't just exist in that linear space between sender and recipient. We can see this in two ways. One is that pseudo-Pauline letters made their way into the New Testament collection, a sign that Paul's style and mode was identified and imitated, that there's a sort of viral quality to the Pauline epistles. But another is that already in the late 1st century AD, people are quoting multiple Pauline letters. And in particular here, 1 Clement, written in Rome probably perhaps as early as AD 90, refers both to Paul's first letter to the Corinthians and to his letter to the Philippians. So the author of this text clearly understood the interrelationship between these texts. Now, whether Paul himself saw the publication of his complete works during his own lifetime, what publication might have meant here, whether such a work appeared alternatively soon after his death, these are impossible questions to answer. The earliest physical evidence for the complete works comes much later in around AD 200. But it is worth pondering on the practicalities of all this. Books were seriously expensive to make and buy in antiquity. Even if the complete works contained only 7 Pauline letters, which is the minimal number that the modern scholars tend to think might be Pauline, it would consist of 24,000 words. That's to say, about 1/3 of the length of Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. By my reckoning, making a book on that scale in antiquity would cost the equivalent of about 50 days' pay for a skilled labourer, which is about £5,000 before tax by 2022 UK standards. Given that the vast majority of people in antiquity lived at subsistence level, it's unlikely that there were many copies of the complete works of Paul floating around. But there probably were some, and many more copies of individual letters. Of course, an individual letter, the shortest Pauline letter is only something like 600 words long and could be placed on a much cheaper material like a wood bark thing or a wax tablet. And when individual letters float around, people presumably recognize them to be part, or some people recognize them to be part of a wider corpus. Even if they'd never read or seen the complete works, they would have understood this to be part of this, a testimony to the existence of the complete works. So for most of the Jesus movement, Paul's complete works may have existed not in the hands, but out there in the network. And this, I would say, is precisely the point, that the early Christian community was held together not by the urban groups themselves, but by the lines that linked them together, the map, the network. Early Christianity was not just a religion without place. It was a religion that rested on a new Augustan experience of space as constituted by filaments, by connectivity, by mobility. It was held together by belief in a larger community that one would never meet, by ritualized memories of a meal that one had never attended, embodied in a book one had never seen, and presided over by a God who had no temple or no home. Now, it's tempting in these contexts to reach for modern analogies. I've already done a certain amount of this, and to speak of early Christianity as a virtual religion, as a religion that exists in some sort of cerebral space rather than being physically embodied. I think this would be misleading. As we've seen, there was a strong virtual, in heavy inverted commas, or networked aspect to the earliest Greek polytheism. Too, to worship Heracles on Thasos was to be transported in the mind across the Mediterranean. What's more, from the start, Christianity existed in real fixed space as well as the network. We shouldn't underestimate the fact that Paul and Peter headed to Rome, the economic capital of the world, and that remained a centrally important dynamic in the perpetuation of Christianity, the fact that Rome could be the center of the hub of the Christian world. But to compare the emergence of Greek polytheism and Christianity is not in any sense to deny the unique qualities of either. It is just to emphasize that all religious revolutions in antiquity represented responses to new ways of conceiving of space. And in particular, as I hope to have illustrated, ancient religious experience was centrally shaped by the idea of the Mediterranean itself. that vast geomarine space beyond the ken of any individual, which served as a proxy for the world as a whole. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that wonderful lecture. And we do have a bit of time for question and answers. So we've got about 10 minutes or so, if anyone would like to kick us off with a question.
Professor Whitmarsh is asked to say more about the Phoenician manufacture of ships to sail on the open sea.
It's the ability to rotate the sail using a boom, and it's the ability to so there are these things called brails, which are holes at the top of the sail, and if you have a sophisticated form of looping rope through it, you can pull them up. So either they go up, they furl up completely, or they furl up at angles like that. So you can actually control the way that you're, both by rotating the sail and by controlling the amount of the sail that is exposed to the wind. You can actually use you can manipulate the ship so as to respond to the very unpredictable nature of winds on the open sea.
Professor Whitmarsh is asked how the consideration of time and space he has presented affects Judaism in the same period.
Again, this is well beyond my expertise, and I'll just give you a very provisional answer. But what I would say is that, the memory of the temple remains extremely important in rabbinical Judaism, as I understand it, as well, and that sense of sort of the loss of the temple. I mean, clearly, this is such a massively complex area. If you think about the fact that in the Second Temple era, it was possible to create a new temple, or at least an experimental new temple at Heliopolis in Egypt. It's clear that Jews could think in very flexible ways about the space of the temple, and there are ways in which Torah scrolls could be understood, as I understand it, as sort of proxies for the temple. Nevertheless, again, to hazard an answer to that, I mean, I think there is a way in which Judaism remained linked to ideas of real physical space that marks a difference from Christianity. But I'm going to row back a little bit from that, because I think that the way in which Christianity develops in the first 4 centuries sees a sort of return to the anchoring of space. I mean, the cults of saints, for example, their ways of monumentalizing local sites of devotion, the building of churches, of course. So Christianity does, despite this sort of this emergence in an era where one could think through the idea of religion without place, that's an impossible reality at one level. I think there's always a way in which religion sort of...
Professor Whitmarsh is asked to say more about parallels being drawn between different Greek and Roman gods.
This is something that, I mean, in the Greek world is called interpretatio Graeca, and in the Roman world is called interpretatio Romana, or at least called by modern scholars. So that this phenomenon of divine translation, which seems to be a more general feature of ancient polytheism as a whole. People have written books. So Jan Assmann wrote about this. Mark Smith wrote about this. Way back, in Sumerian times, when you've got comparative lists of deities and the like. So, and those earliest examples are, it seems, I mean, this is again second-hand understanding of these things, but it seems that material is to do with the creation of treaties. So you actually have to know that you're both swearing by the same deity, so you have to have these sort of comparison lists or whatever. So it might be a feature of international diplomacy at one level, but it becomes one of the quirks of a Greco-Roman conception of space, that their pantheon is, I tried to describe it as both sort of infinitely expansible, so that, if you are in a polytheistic system, you can always add a new god on. It doesn't really threaten the system as a whole, because it's polytheistic to start with, but it also has this principle of economy, as I was calling it, that folds in on itself and tries not to expand too much, to sort of economize and to say, well, Astarte, for example, she's basically Aphrodite, might have a local flavor or whatever. So I think it's a way of, it's a sort of theological mode that is, as I say, it's part of the deep inheritance of ancient Near Eastern polytheism that comes into the Greco-Roman world. It's also a imperialist, colonialist, expansionist kind of ideology, which says that, we can always understand these peoples that we take over. We can always do business with them. We can always integrate them. We can fit them into our system. But it's also, as I say, there's a way in which there's a sort of rationalizing desire for simplicity and order and economy underlying as well that tries to fit it all together and tries to make sense in almost sort of mathematical way of how all these things would join up.
Okay, well, falls to me now to bring the event to a close, but it's only the end of the formal time together. I want to do three things. First of all, to draw your attention to the last Gifford lecture of the series, and that's going to take place in a fortnight's time. There are little notes on the desks about it. So our final lecture will be given by Professor John Dupre of the University of Exeter, and that will be on Tuesday the 29th of November, again at 6 p.m. Secondly, I'd like to invite you all to join Professor Whitmarsh and others at the drinks reception, which will take place immediately afterwards. And it's in the James Mackay Hall, which is just out the door here, and it's in the next door along, and we'll show everybody where that is. And finally, of course, please join me in, once again, showing your appreciation to Professor Whitmarsh for not only his engaging lecture, but also for his generosity in responding to questions. So thank you very much.